in which it is Fish Day on the Mary Rose, anchored in Portsmouth Harbour. Saturday the 18th of July 1545 was a fish day on the Mary Rose. The crew ate on the cramped gun deck, sitting wherever they could find room. Fish days were not popular. Sailors referred to salt cod as Poor John. But on this Saturday, the meal provided a welcome break from frantic activity as all 185 soldiers, 30 gunners, and 200 mariners on board were busy readying the ship for war. The ship's crew was divided into messes of 6 to 8 men who ate together. Each mess was entitled to 1/4 of a 24-inch salt cod, which was steeped in vats of fresh water for 24 hours, tied into cloth bags, and secured with a peg bearing the mark of their particular mess. The bags ensured that even though the fish disintegrated into flakes as it cooked, every mess received their fair share. The depths of the ship soon filled with the smell of cooking fish as the bags were set to simmer in the larger of the galley's cauldrons. When it was ready, the fish was doled out in equal portions into the men's wooden bowls, and they set to eating with wooden or horn spoons. On fish days, every man was allowed 4 ounces of cheese and 2 of butter, and as the ship was in port, every man was also given a loaf of bread. This made a welcome change from the hard and worm-eaten biscuits that they had to make do with when they were at sea. They washed down the salty fish with gulps from their allowance of a gallon of beer. While the crew ate, their superiors discussed their fate. Anchored alongside the Mary Rose in Portsmouth Harbour was the flagship, the Henry Grâce à Dieu. Here the King, Henry VIII, was in council with the Lord Admiral of the fleet, Viscount Lisle, and the Mary Rose's commander, Vice Admiral George Carew. A French fleet had set sail for England 12 days previously and was expected to engage the English in battle the next day. The Mary Rose, as one of the fleet's bigger warships, was at the centre of the coming engagement. By the end of the following day, almost all of the crew were dead, drowned when the Mary Rose sank only a few minutes after going into battle. The gunners had just fired a round of cannon when a chance gust of wind caused the ship, overloaded with ordnance, to simultaneously turn and heel over. Most of the men were on the upper decks, where they were caught in the web of anti-boarding netting and taken down as she sank. At most 40 survived, out of a crew of 415. The wreck has bequeathed to us one of the best collections of Tudor artefacts, including shoes and tunics, medicine vials and carpentry tools, guns, bows and arrows, and the skeletons of 179 men, a rat and a dog. In the hold, archaeologists recovered the vertebrae of cattle and pigs, as well as thousands of fish spines. These were the residue of the ship's store of beef, pork, and cod. The pork and beef on the Mary Rose would have come from English herds of swine and cattle, but the fish was not a local product. Genetic analysis of the fish bones indicates that the cod had been caught in the North Sea and around Iceland. But one of the bones analysed was from a fish that came from much further afield, belonging to a genetic cluster of cod that lived off the northeastern coast of the American continent. By the middle of the 16th century, the Tudors were clearly venturing thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean in order to secure a staple foodstuff. The medieval Christian practice of abstaining from meat on fast days had given rise to thriving European fisheries. In the 14th century, the Dutch mastered the art of pickling their North Sea herring catch in salt, which enabled even those devout northern Europeans living far inland to forego meat on Fridays. In the 15th century, pickled herring was eclipsed by Norwegian stockfish, air-dried cod that was distributed throughout northern Europe by the Hanseatic League. The League's attempts to monopolise the North Sea catch drove the English to seek new fishing grounds. They found one on the continental shelf just off Iceland. The Danish authorities soon complained that the English who set up camp there in the summer months treated the island as though it were their own, digging ditches, putting up tents, even building houses, and assaulting competing Icelandic fishermen. While the Icelanders wind-dried their catch, the English at first simply salted the cod before piling it in the holds of their boats. But over time, they combined these two preservation methods, lightly salting the fish before allowing it to dry in the air. The end product was both tastier than Norwegian stockfish and could be kept longer. In the second half of the 15th century, Bristol emerged as England's major fish entrepot. Bristol ships would sail to Iceland to buy up salt cod and then continue to southern Europe and as far afield as the Spanish Canary Islands and the Azores to exchange the fish for wine. The city's place at the heart of this trade made Bristol a centre of knowledge about Atlantic navigation. It was therefore no coincidence that the Venetian Juan Caboto, better known by his anglicised name John Cabot, set sail from Bristol when in 1497 he went in search of a northern sea route to the Spice Islands. A group of Bristol merchants had already funded at least 3 western voyages to search for the mythical land of High Brazil, said to lie beyond Ireland. Some of these expeditions had almost certainly found land. They returned to Bristol laden down with salted and dried cod that it would have been impossible to dry on board ship. Cabot would have drawn on this local knowledge, and after only 35 days at sea, his expedition arrived on the northeastern coast of Canada. He had discovered not the hoped-for sea route to the Indies, but the land the Vikings had called Helluland, and that Henry VII now christened Newfoundland. When Henry VIII inherited the throne from his father in 1509, he began enlarging the English navy. The Mary Rose, completed in 1511, was part of his ambitious shipbuilding programme. By 1545, the king had used the wealth he had confiscated from the monasteries to build up a fleet of 58 ships. These were the beginnings of the navy that eventually played an important role in creating Britain's seaborne empire. A series of cold winters and poor harvests after Henry VIII's death in 1547 meant that England was beset by food shortages. Naval victuallers struggled to supply the ships of the line with sufficient food. The suppression of rebellion in Ireland further increased demand for salt cod in order to feed the 15,200 English soldiers who were stationed there by the end of Elizabeth's reign. The soldiers liked fish days little better than the sailors. Its unpopularity notwithstanding, the demand for salt cod outstripped supply, and in 1595 army suppliers were forced to specially commission 2 fishing vessels to sail to Newfoundland to acquire salt cod provisions for the forces in Ireland. Each spring, a flotilla of about 100 ships set sail to Newfoundland from the West Country. Most sailed via France, Portugal, or West Africa to buy salt, and then turned west to cross the Atlantic. The first ships to arrive in Newfoundland had the pick of the best harbours. Once the captain had chosen a good spot for a base camp, the fishing could begin. In the early morning, the boats would row out to sea. The cod was so thick by the shore that one visitor to Newfoundland described how he was hardly able to row a boat through them. Towards the afternoon, the boats would return, laden down with as many as 1,000 cod. Newfoundland's beaches were transformed into open-air factories. James Young, a ship surgeon who accompanied a group of fishermen to Newfoundland in 1662, described how, as the fish were thrown out of the boat, a boy would pick them up and lay them on a table on either side of which stood two men. The first, known as the header, dexterously opened the belly of each fish and took out the liver, which he dropped into a tub under the table. He then twisted off the head, which, along with the guts, fell back into the sea through the slats in the landing stage. The header then thrust the fish across the table to the second man, known as the splitter, who with a strong knife splits it abroad and with a backstroke cuts off the bone. They worked so rapidly that they could process as many as 480 fish in just half an hour. The split fish were thrown into a barrow and passed on to the salter. The fish were left in the salt for a few days before being washed in seawater, then spread out on racks to dry in the wind. Once dried, they were piled up and pressed to make the salt sweat out of the flesh, a process known as corning, during which the cod turned white. Once they were finished, the fish were stored in dry piles, which by the end of the season were as large as haystacks. From the late 16th century, Dutch, French, and even a few Spanish-owned vessels would arrive in Newfoundland each year towards the end of the spring, laden with cargoes of wine, which they exchanged for salt fish. As a result, by 1620, only about 10% of the Newfoundland catch was actually brought back to England, with most of it being taken to southern Europe. In September, the West Country fishermen sailed home, their ships loaded with barrels of wine as well as salt fish to sell on to military provisioning officers. The Newfoundland fishery thus grew into a thriving branch of English commerce. The economies of the West Country ports were dominated by the fisheries, with at least 6,000 landlubbers employed in supporting trades such as shipbuilding, rope and sail-making. For West Country mariners, long-range travel across the Atlantic Ocean had become a routine activity. The Southern Europeans' continuing appetite for salt cod eventually outweighed the English demand for Southern European comestibles. This allowed England to gain access to New World specie, as the Spanish were forced to pay for some of the fish in silver. English merchants put the Spanish silver to good use, funding trading ventures to the Levant, Muscovy, and East India. The British Empire was born on Newfoundland's stony beaches. The fishermen living in temporary shacks on the edge of a vast continent, their leather aprons covered with fish scales and blood, conquered distance with their innovative food processing techniques and laid down the foundations of empire. Between 1570 and 1689, the tonnage of English shipping grew sevenfold, and England emerged as a major European sea power. The nation's first venture into food processing on an industrial scale played an important part in enabling it to take an active and independent role in world trade. Both as a portable foodstuff and as a trading commodity, Poor John was one of the building blocks of the British Empire. In which the Holloway family eat maize bread and salt beef succotash, Sandwich, New England. In June 1647, Joseph Holloway returned home worn out after a long morning surveying the highways to eat dinner with his family. He sat down thankfully in one of the two chairs they possessed, while his children gathered around the board balanced on trestles that served them as a table. Even though the Holloways were one of the wealthiest of the 61 families who 10 years previously had founded the settlement of Sandwich in New England, they did not own a table. The family's other chair was occupied by Joseph's wife, Rose, while their eldest children, Joseph and Sarah, aged 11 and 7, perched on stools. The two smaller girls, 4-year-old Mary and 3-year-old Experience, had tree stumps to sit on, and Hope Still, the baby, was passed around from lap to lap. Rose had risen early that morning to bake the mixed wheat and cornmeal loaf that she now placed before them. The English preferred unadulterated wheat bread, but the crop did not generally do well in this part of America. The harsh winters killed the winter wheat, and the spring varieties were afflicted by wheat blast, a form of rust that left the plant with empty and shriveled ears. Maize was the only reliable source of grain, and Joseph planted at least 5 acres with Indian corn. Fearful that in America's strange climate they would degenerate to the savage state of the Native Americans, the English settlers clung to bread as the food of the civilized. Although cornmeal does not lend itself to bread making, it lacks the gluten that gives wheat bread its texture. They persisted in using it as they would wheat flour to make loaves. Cornmeal bread was most successful when the meal was mixed with rye flour, and loaves of rye and injun were the usual staple fare of New Englanders. Next to the loaf was a large round hard cheese and a little pot of butter. Joseph's 19 cattle were good milkers, and the Holloways owned a cheese press that enabled them to produce English-style hard cheeses. Their store also contained salt pork, salt beef, and a hogshead of malt. Bread, milk, butter, cheese, beef, and a good mug of beer were the staples of the 17th century English diet. In all but the cornmeal and the bread, the Holloways' dinner appeared to resemble the food of England's middling farmers. On closer inspection, however, their dish of salt beef yielded telltale signs that the family was sitting down to eat in America rather than England. Rose had been simmering the beef in a pot hung over the fire since early that morning. But lima beans, kernels of maize, and American squash took the place of English vegetables in the Holloways' beef stew, transforming it into the Native American one-pot dish known as succotash, the English pronunciation of the Narragansett Indian sakatahash. The Holloways were part of the great migration of 14,000 English Puritans who left England in the 1630s. Religion is usually portrayed as the main factor motivating New England's colonists, but the social upheaval of 17th century England, rather than a religious calling, motivated the majority of those crossing the Atlantic. As small holdings and common lands were amalgamated into enclosed estates, the smallest and poorest tenant farmers were evicted. They were attracted to New England as a place where they might realise the utopian commonwealth where the whole people be landlords, as depicted in the 1656 tract Oceana by the Republican author James Harrington. New towns proliferated, and each immigrant family was allocated its own farm. The 25 founders of the town of Taunton thanked God for bringing them to this place and settling of us on lands of our own, bought with our money, for a possession for ourselves and for our posterity after us. What the New England settlers stubbornly refused to recognise was that they were stealing other people's land. The first band of settlers did not happen across a pristine wilderness, but a landscape that had been managed for centuries by the Native Americans. Indeed, it was the Patuxet people who had made the clearings in the forest where the initial band of settlers planted their first crops. Before these bore fruit, the colonists survived only because they discovered stores of maize buried by the Native Americans before they were wiped out by epidemics of European diseases introduced by the West Countrymen who had tried to found the settlement of Sagadahoc 14 years earlier. The spirit of sharing embodied in the first Thanksgiving meal, when Wampanoag Indians celebrated the harvest with the Plymouth settlers in the autumn of 1621, was soon betrayed, as any Indian group that opposed English intrusion onto their land was violently subjugated. The English refused to recognise Native American clearings in the forest as farms. But when New England settlers tried to impose English-style agriculture on American soil, they ran up against a series of obstacles that forced them to compromise their ideals. New England was chronically short of labour. This prevented the first settlers from taking full advantage of the very thing they had come to America for, the abundant land. With only the assistance of their wives and children, they struggled to clear the dense forest and transform it into productive fields. The task was overwhelming, yet the need for food pressing. Bread and meat were very scarce, and the settlers reluctantly relied on seafood such as clams and mussels, although they despised them as food fit only for the poor and desperate. Having condemned the Native Americans as lazy, the English were forced to adopt their methods of cultivation and crops. High-yielding maize could be planted around rotting tree stumps, in soil that had been hoed rather than ploughed, and squash and beans could be grown in among the maize plants. Indeed, by 1700, most New England farmers had given up the struggle to grow wheat. From the Native Americans, they learned how to make maize flatbreads, known variously as Johnny or Journey cake, spoon bread, hoe cake, or pone. Eventually, New Englanders identified so strongly with their corn breads, journey cakes, and their succotash stews, renamed boiled dinners, that their Native American origins were forgotten. They were redefined as plain, unassuming foods, eminently suited to the palate of the plain, honest American. Joseph Holloway had fenced in about 10 acres of his land in order to grow crops, and then released his herd of cattle to forage on his remaining 20 acres of unfenced meadow, marsh, and woodland. The settlers did not even attempt to properly control their cattle, allowing the animals to lumber around the countryside, trampling and eating any Native American gardens they came across, and causing great resentment. Indeed, this free-range form of animal husbandry developed into a mode of conquest. More cattle were imported into the colony than new settlers, and as the herds required more land to sustain them, the settlers moved into neighbouring areas, founding townships and giving rise to new colonies: Maryland, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New Haven, driving the Native Americans out of their territories and consolidating the European hold on America. The grandiose plans to improve America may not have been realized, but the settlers had managed to secure for themselves an almost ideal English diet, rich in beef, milk, butter, and cheese. Indeed, by the end of the 17th century, colonial Americans were probably the best-fed people on the planet. The superiority of American nutrition was revealed by the height of American soldiers during the War of Independence, when they were on average 3.5 inches taller than their British counterparts. But if they were self-sufficient in staple foods, New Englanders were voracious consumers of English-manufactured goods, ranging from practical equipment such as farm implements to frivolities like parrot cages. Early American colonial homes were sparsely furnished. Even the better off often only possessed a cupboard, a chest, and a few cooking implements. But as they became more affluent, they bought feather beds, pewter plates, silver spoons, and chairs. In the old country, a farmer might wear a velvet coat and drink from a pewter goblet, but his reputation rested on the state of his land and livestock and his relationships with his neighbours. In the new world of untidy fields and semi-wild cattle, possessions became important markers of gentility. In order to buy all these goods, New Englanders needed to generate an income. The colony of family farms had little to sell other than surplus food supplies, mainly barrels of salt beef. These they sold to the increasingly prosperous West Indian sugar islands. But New England's salt beef was considered coarse, black, and much inferior to the Irish. An Antiguan planter complained to his supplier that the beef he had sent him does by no means answer your kind intention of regaling our palates, for if it be sound, it be too hard and salt, but generally it stinks. Still, salt beef became the second most valuable of all New England's exports. Its prime export, however, was salt fish. In the 1640s, the New England fishery boomed, benefiting from the disruption of the Newfoundland trade when the English Civil War prevented many West Country fishermen from making their annual migration. New England now joined the Atlantic Triangle of Trade, sending its best quality product to southern Europe and over 3,500 barrels of second-rate fish a year to Jamaica to feed the African slaves on the island's newly established sugar plantations. By 1680, more than half the ships arriving and leaving Boston Harbor were engaged in trade with the Caribbean, which was becoming the trading hub of the Atlantic Empire. New England's first settlers sought to establish a society where the middling farmer could enjoy his freedom and independence. Out of this grew a powerful ideology celebrating the yeoman farmer and idealizing the family farm. After American independence, it became a central tenet of American politics that it was the role of government to protect the citizen's right to live an independent and self-sufficient life on a farmstead. This way of thinking still permeates American republicanism today. At the heart of this ideology, however, lay a tangle of contradictions. Even though New England owed much of its prosperity to fishermen and cattle breeders, fishing and livestock farming were regarded as secondary and far less noble occupations. Cornbread and boiled dinners were interpreted as the wholesome foods of the family farm, and yet these dishes derived from the farming and food practices of the Native Americans. And while New England's family farms were presented as free of the taint of slave labour, the market for their salt beef and fish, corn, horses and cattle was the West Indies, where slave labour produced the sugar, molasses and rum that the plantations exchanged for these goods. New England and the West Indies formed a mutually sustaining whole, in which the prosperity of the American yeoman depended on the labour of the West African slave. In which Lady Anne Barnard enjoys fine cabin dinners on a voyage to the Cape of Good Hope, February to May 1797. Every day at 2 o'clock, the passengers on board the Sir Edward Hughes assembled in the ship's cuddy, or saloon cabin, to dine. According to Lady Anne Barnard, for the most part they got on like lambs. There was gentle and brave General Hartley, and the amiable Mrs. Saul, Mr. Keith and aide-de-camp, and Colonel Lloyd. The only disagreeable members of the party were Captain Campbell and his wife, who might have been handsome if not so ill-tempered. As the principal lady, Anne sat next to the ship's captain. She was accompanying her husband, Andrew Barnard, who had just been appointed Colonial Secretary to the Cape of Good Hope. The French Revolutionary Army had overrun the Netherlands in 1795, and the British were determined that the Dutch colony on the southern tip of Africa should not fall into French hands, as it was a key staging post on the sea route to India. As a Cape Dutch woman, Mrs. Campbell was evidently unhappy about the British occupation of her home, and continually made rude remarks about the parcel of people the British were sending to the colony. Lady Anne and her companions were obliged to drop common conversation with them beyond the necessities of society. Lady Anne did not, however, allow the Campbells to spoil her enjoyment of the voyage. Captain James Ermiston kept a generous table, and a typical menu included hog's puddings, mutton pies, 2 fowls, 2 hams, 2 ducks, removed by an enormous plum pudding, port wine, sherry, gin, rum, etc. The British occupation of the Dutch Cape Colony was only the latest twist in a century and a half of conflict. For most of the time between 1650 and 1815, the British were at war with either the French, the Spanish, or the Dutch. With every conflict, the Royal Navy grew, and at the height of the 1793 to 1815 war with France, It mustered over 147,000 men sailing in more than 800 ships. In 1808, the British fleet in the Baltic alone required 960,000 pounds of bread, 36,000 gallons of rum, 60,000 pieces of pork, and 33,000 pieces of beef. At the turn of the century, between 10,000 and 20,000 extra cattle were slaughtered each year at London's Smithfield Market to supply the ships of the line with fresh beef. Pig farms proliferated around London, using the waste barley and malt from breweries to fatten the hogs. Local suppliers found it difficult to meet the unpredictable surges in demand, and so the victualling department set up slaughterhouses, breweries, and bakehouses at the naval dockyards. The Navy eventually turned to Ireland to make up its shortfall. At first, the 17th century Cattle Acts, banning the import of Irish goods into England, prevented the Admiralty from taking advantage of the fact that Irish salt beef and butter were cheap. But when naval stores ran dry, the victuallers were given permission to buy meat and butter in Ireland. A series of acts reopened trade after 1758, and from then on, Ireland became a major naval supplier. Its exports of salted beef, pork, and butter doubled, and Irish horse became sailors' slang for salt beef. In an effort to improve the sailors' health, oatmeal, sugar, pickled cabbage, lemon juice, cocoa, dried fruit, suet and rum were added to their ration. In 1754, the pioneering ship surgeon James Lind suggested that portable soup might alleviate scurvy. It was made by simmering meat in water for hours until it was reduced to a jelly. By 1793, Ratcliffe's Soup House in London was producing 897 tons a year, which it sold to both the Army and the Navy. Ships' chandlers added it to their list of groceries for the merchant marine, and adverts for portable soup of the best sorts began appearing in London newspapers. In the 18th century, Britain's export trade to the colonies was the fastest growing sector of the economy. North America absorbed about a third of its output of woolens, while West Africa exchanged slaves for English cottons and chintzes, and the West Indies took abundant quantities of Scottish and Irish linen to clothe the slaves who toiled on the sugar plantations. Fledgling societies in the colonies imported British manufactures, ranging from farming equipment and sugar refining pots to watches and clocks. Pewter and brass basins, pots and tankards were popular among the West African slave traders. Americans were as eager for English cheeses, pickles and hams as they were for buttons, clocks and nails. North American newspapers began to advertise the arrival of parcels of pickled mushrooms and London-made jellies, sauces and pickles. In among Connecticut onions, Philadelphian wheat flour and Carolina rice, grocers such as Gregory Purcell in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, stocked a range of imported foods: Irish May butter and salt pork, Dorchester ale, Florence oil, and West Indian rum and citrus fruits. By mid-century, the American colonies were importing £1.3 million worth of British goods each year. India too was a growing market, absorbing just under 10% of Britain's exports, among them preserved salmon, lobsters, oysters, herrings, and other exotic fish, hams, reindeer tongues, liqueurs, dried fruits, and a long list of foreign dainties. Officers on East India Company ships were encouraged to take with them to eastern ports a variety of domestic commodities. On a 755-ton ship, they were allotted about 90 tons of cargo space as an indulgence, which they could fill with any goods as long as they did not come under the company's monopoly. Restricted goods were company staples such as nankeen cloth, raw silk, tea and chinaware. This system ensured that the Europe shops in the Asian ports were well stocked with hats, haberdashery, perfumery and provisions. Most of the time the officers could be fairly certain of making a profit of 100% on their investment. Occasionally, things did not go quite to plan. In May 1769, the East India Company officers on board the fleet bound for Madras suffered the misfortune that not only did all the ships arrive within 10 days of each other, but they had all brought glassware with them, as there had been such demand for it the previous year. They were forced to sell their goods at a 60% loss. The empire trade in provisions gave rise to new products. Indian pale ale was developed to cater to the market of thirsty colonists. Traditionally, in October, the English landed classes brewed a well-hopped and therefore very bitter pale ale known as stock beer. It was designed to take a few months to mature and so could be kept over the winter. For this reason, it was thought the most suitable beer to ship to the colonies, as it would best survive the long journey. A small Bow brewery just up the Thames from the East India Docks at Blackwall was popular with company captains, as its owner, George Hodson, extended them 18 months' credit. In fact, the 4 to 5 month long journey to India was discovered to have a beneficial impact on Hodson's stock beer. The rocking motion of the ship, combined with the gradual application of heat as it sailed first to the Atlantic wine islands and then on to Rio de Janeiro, from where the trade winds blew it back east to Cape Town and on to India, resulted in a beer with a depth of flavour that could be achieved in England only after years in the cellar. Hodson's became an icon of British life in India. It became so much a part of company culture that failing to omit the G in the pronunciation of the beer's name, Hodgson's, had the effect of instantly marking out the newcomer to India. As with pale ale, it was discovered that Madeira was greatly improved by a prolonged voyage. If it was fortified with brandy, it was found to taste even better. The Madeiran winemakers were responsive to the feedback they received from their various markets. Eventually, they constructed special steam-powered machinery to simulate the heat and agitation of long-distance maritime travel. Dark, sweet wines were made for the West Indian sugar barons, heavily fortified pale, dry white Madeira for the South Carolina rice planters. Every taste was catered for, and no colonial meal was complete without a bottle of Madeira on the table. The exchange of provisions was two-way. While barrels of Bristol tripe, jars of preserves, and pipes of Madeira made their way to the colonies, colonials had assorted exotic goods sent home for their own use or as gifts for relatives and friends. Traditionally, when a host wanted to impress his dinner guests, he served venison. Venison celebrated the established social order. Power and status was derived from land, which gave the aristocracy exclusive access to deer. In the second half of the 18th century, however, commercial men began to celebrate their links to the world of trade with turtle dinners. These were hearty affairs, as some of the animals weighed as much as 500 pounds and consisted of 5 different dishes. Despite the meat's slightly musky smell, epicures raved that it had the consistency of butter and tasted like bone marrow. Luxury cookbooks began including recipes for turtle. Turtle meat was best eaten fresh, and so the poor creatures were transported live in barrels of water. In The Lady's Complete Guide, or Cookery in all its branches, Mary Cole gave the grisly instruction to remove the animal from the barrel of water and chop off its head, and then bleed the carcass before butchering it into the separate cuts. Turtle was routinely served at the Lord Mayor of London's banquet for the aldermen of London City Council. Indeed, turtle dinners became so popular with scientific, gambling and male dining clubs that some feared the meat might displace roast beef as the symbol of wholehearted Englishness. It is an indication of how embedded the empire was within British culture that a feast based on an exotic foreign creature could be seen as symbolic of Englishness. By the end of the 18th century, it seemed perfectly normal to transport potentially perishable food and drink over immense distances. Flexible and ingenious manufacturers who listened carefully to their customers and adapted their goods to their tastes had produced a wide range of ready-made foods and sophisticated drinks that meant the moneyed traveller and colonist could replace hardtack with crackers, salt meat with hams, and beer with refined pale ales and fortified wine. The branding of food products had begun, with the association of foods with particular places, ham with Yorkshire, tripe with Bristol, and oil with Florence, to give them an air of authenticity and quality. It had been discovered that intensive marketing and advertising reaped rewards, and producers and distributors had taken to the practice with enthusiasm. In all these ways, the colonial trade in provisions laid the groundwork for the rise of the industrialized food industry. In which Kamala prepares a meal for her family near Patna, Bihar, February 1811. Freshly bathed, Kamala set about preparing her family's evening meal. First, she smoothed fresh cow dung in a circle to define a purified cooking space and sprinkled it with a few drops of water. Then she took some chilies and cast them on the grinding stone with a few drops of safflower oil. She crushed the chilies to a fine paste and added them to flour made from finely ground maize. When she stepped outside the area of the hearth to fetch water, she was careful to wash her hands and feet again before returning to her cooking. She poured a little of the water into corn flour and kneaded it vigorously to make an unboiled pudding known as sattu. Meanwhile, Kamala's daughter prepared a chutney by grinding together a few black peppercorns, some salt, and a little ginger with a handful of Bengali currants. When the food was ready, the women called the men to come and eat. They broke off from their work of strewing the fertilizing ashes from the fireplace around the poppies. They too washed their hands and feet, then cast a small amount of food into the fire. Kamala served her husband first, and then their two sons, the elder followed by the younger. The women would eat later, once the men had had their fill. Kamala and her family lived near Patna in the province of Bihar. In 1811, the province had been under East India Company rule for nearly 40 years. In 1765, their army had defeated the combined forces of the Mughal Emperor and the Nawab of Bengal, and as a result, they were able to force the emperor to grant the company itself, rather than an Indian noble, the governorship of the province. Ownership of the land was transferred to the tax-collecting nobility, or zamindaries, who were thus transformed into a version of Britain's landed aristocracy. But rather than creating a body of English-style improving landlords, the company brought into being a rapacious rentier class, whose aim was to extract as much revenue from their tenants as possible. To the satisfaction of the East India Company, the peasantry raised the money to pay their taxes by growing cash crops such as indigo and cotton. The cash crop of most value to the company was opium. East India Company merchants were aware that there was a steady demand for Bengal opium among the Chinese. Since European traders had introduced tobacco to China in the late 16th century, smoking and drinking tea had become such complementary activities for the Chinese that they found it hard to imagine engaging in one without the other, and referred to the practice as yencha, smoke and tea. Early in the 18th century, tea house owners had introduced a new, expensive blend of tobacco cut with opium, and by the end of the century, the wealthy had dispensed with the tobacco altogether. In China, smoking pure opium became a mark of elite social status. Chinese gentlemen demonstrated their affluence and good taste with the elaborate equipment associated with opium inhalation: inlaid wooden boxes, intricate lamps, decorated spoons and pipes. Opium devotees showed a marked preference for the mild Patna opium from eastern India over the more fiery and potentially irritating Malwa opium grown in the West. The East India Company realised that the Indian district over which they now ruled produced a commodity for which there was a potentially vast Chinese market. In 1773, they took over the production and sale of opium in Bengal. Each September, the company granted licenses to cultivate poppies to skilled market gardeners like Kamala and her family, who lived around Patna and Benares. Poppies were a temperamental crop, and the harvesting of the opium was labour-intensive. Small incisions had to be made in the thousands of seed heads over a period of 3 to 4 weeks. It was back-breaking work to scrape the latex oozing from the incisions into a shallow brass bowl. The work involved the farmer's entire family, and in this way the East India Company co-opted a large body of hidden and unpaid labour. In the spring, the company's assistant sub-deputy would tour the villages, supervising the various headmen as they weighed and graded the cakes of crude opium. It was packed into large earthenware jars, loaded onto carts, and transported under armed guard to one of 2 company processing factories at Bankipur and Ghazipur. Here it was refined, shaped into balls, covered with a protective wrapper of steamed poppy petals, and packed into 140-pound chests. These were then transported to Calcutta, where they were sold at auction to private shipping companies. This was where the company's official involvement with the opium trade ended. The company delegated the illegal section of the trade to private merchants. In theory, imports of opium into China were banned. However, lying at anchor just off the southern Chinese coast were a number of heavily armed, broken-down East Indiamen. The merchants used these as floating opium warehouses. The ships from Calcutta would unload their chests of opium onto the receiving ships, and at night Chinese smugglers would row out to them in their longboats with many oars, known as scrambling dragons. Drawing alongside, they would place a bag of silver in one side of a scale, and the merchants would balance it with opium, the price being weight for weight. The longboats then made their way up the Pearl River past Canton, running the gauntlet of the numerous checkpoints and patrols that were supposed to make it impossible for European goods to enter China without the permission of the Chinese authorities. But the customs officers and soldiers manning the patrols were in the pay of the smugglers and turned a blind eye to their comings and goings. From the late 18th century until the end of British rule in India in 1947, opium revenues were the 3rd most important source of income for the Indian government after land revenue and the salt tax. Nevertheless, rather than being reinvested in India, by far the greater proportion of the money generated by their labour was remitted back to Britain. By means of the China trade, opium production allowed the company and its agents to siphon off India's wealth. For Chinese labourers, a pipe of opium was the equivalent of the British workman's cup of sweetened tea. Opium was at times abused, and it was addictive, but the idea that China was incapacitated by a hopelessly drug-addicted population was absurd propaganda. A British consul based in Hainan was surprised to find that, although nearly everyone uses opium, one never meets the opium skeleton so vividly depicted in philanthropic works. Rather the reverse, a hardy peasantry, healthy and energetic. Why then did the Chinese government demonize the opium habit and take measures to suppress the trade? Qing officials blamed the opium trade for the silver famine the Chinese economy was experiencing. Every year, purchases of opium were draining $18 million worth of silver out of the economy. Merchant ships returning to London, Calcutta and Bombay did stash silver bullion in their holds, as well as crates of tea, but the Chinese seem to have been unaware that about 3/4 of the silver paid for opium was channeled straight back to them in payment for tea and silk. The causes of China's silver famine were, in fact, far more complex. In 1827, the depletion of Spain's American silver mines triggered a worldwide depression, and the quantity of silver entering the global market declined. The flow of silver into the Chinese economy from foreign merchants was therefore diminished. At the same time, declining production in the Yunnan copper mines led to the debasement of the copper and bronze coins that were China's real currency. But it was easier for officials to blame China's economic crisis on unscrupulous foreign merchants than it was to address the problem by improving the copper coinage and creating a stable silver currency. The issue of silver, opium, and the balance of trade was a smokescreen. The emperor and his government were humiliated by rumours that both the military and the Chinese merchants were openly conniving in the illegal opium trade. The response of the xenophobic section among Chinese officials was to call for a trade embargo. The emperor and his government, however, knew that this was neither in the government's financial interest, nor was it enforceable. In May 1836, Ran Yuan, the leader of a group of bureaucrats in alliance with a Canton-based merchants' academy, the Xuehai Tang, suggested to the emperor that the problem would best be tackled by both legalizing the import of Indian opium and encouraging domestic production. This would hopefully pull the carpet out from under the smugglers' feet and allow the government to regulate both the trade and the drug's consumption. But a group of dissatisfied literati, calling themselves the Spring Purification Movement, persuaded the emperor to embark on a crusade against opium addiction. The emperor scrapped Yuan's legalization plans and appointed the Spring Purification Party's ally, Lin Zhu, as Governor-General of Canton. It was Lin who forced a diplomatic impasse in June 1839 by seizing and destroying the opium in the European factories within Canton and closing the channel to shipping, in effect imprisoning the foreign traders in the city. When William Jarden, until recently the foremost of Canton's opium merchants, arrived in London 2 months after the Chinese seizure of the Europeans' opium, he immediately began pressing Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, to wage war on China in retaliation. In November 1839, a British fleet arrived off the coast of Canton, including the Nemesis, the first iron paddle steamer to round the Cape of Good Hope, equipped with shells and Congreve rockets against which China's defences were hopelessly inadequate. The war ended ignominiously for them in August 1842, when they signed the Treaty of Nanking, still referred to in China as the first of the unequal treaties. The British forced the Chinese to open 5 treaty ports to their ships, and Canton returned to business as usual. Opium smoking came to symbolize China's inability to resist Europe's intrusion into its economy, and became regarded as a degenerate practice. The end result of the campaign of moral outrage was the first International Opium Commission, which met in Shanghai in 1909. The commission agreed to make illegal all trade in narcotic substances and to apply this principle globally. These commitments are the source of our contemporary legal framework, outlawing opium and its derivatives. The opium trade tends to attract almost as much moral opprobrium as the Atlantic slave trade. The evil of opium is supposed to have drained silver out of the economy while turning the Chinese into a nation of hopeless addicts, smoking themselves to death while their country descended into chaos. However, by repeatedly retelling the story of the opium trade in these terms, we have fallen victim to an opium myth. In which infantryman R.L. Crimp eats bully beef and sweet potatoes in a forward camp in the North African desert. In September 1941, R.L. Crimp found himself in an austere and primitive forward camp in the North African desert, a couple of 100 miles behind the front line. Life was led entirely in the open air, under the broiling sun by day, and by night in blanket beds on the hard desert surface under the stars. Crimp had been assigned to a motorized infantry unit of 30 trucks. His section's truck, called Mabel after the driver's wife, was surrounded by their gear and supplies: a Bren gun, a boy's anti-tank rifle, several boxes of ammunition, a large Italian medical chest in which they stored their rations, about half a dozen 2-gallon water cans, and another half a dozen supposedly untouchable cans to be kept for an emergency. At 6 o'clock each evening, one man from each of the sections was called to collect their rations. Equipped with sacks, canisters, and empty water cans, they made their way over to the quartermaster's sergeant, who had already laid out 4 cans of bully for each 6-man section, a tin of milk, a tin of cheese, and 1 orange per man. The men greeted him with the usual opening gambit: "What, no fresh meat?" In fact, fresh meat only ever appeared once in a blue moon, but the men made it a habit to groan over their bully beef. The chances were that the cans of bully beef had been shipped all the way to North Africa from the Fray Bentos canning factory in Argentina, which supplied Britain with most of its corned beef during the war. "Anyone now for Kraft's specials?" called out the sergeant. This was the hardtack the troops compared to dog biscuits. No doubt the 28-pound tins had been packed in Carr's Carlisle biscuit factory. Last, but certainly not least, the sugar and tea were carefully measured out. Heavily laden, the men made their way back to camp. As darkness fell, Crimp's section prepared themselves a simple dinner of bully beef and tinned potatoes, followed by rice pudding with a dollop of jam and an orange. Then the men began the serious business of brewing tea. The brew can was filled with water and set over a biscuit tin with a few inches of petrol-soaked sand in the bottom. When the water had come to a rolling boil, a couple of handfuls of tea leaves were thrown in, and the brew was set aside to strengthen. Meanwhile, tinned milk and sugar were distributed among the mugs gathered around the fire. "As long as there's no lack of char or fags, everyone's happy," wrote Crimp. "When there's a shortage of either, morale slumps." When war broke out in 1939, the British Isles sat at the centre of a complex trading web. Every day between 15 and 20 ships docked at British ports, bringing the wheat, meat, sugar, tea, and canned milk that fed the nation's working classes. In 1939, Britain imported from Canada virtually all the wheat it used to make bread. It also imported large quantities of grain as fodder for livestock, as British farms still produced almost half of the country's meat supplies and all of its milk. However, in wartime it made more sense to grow wheat and import meat. The farmers out on Canada's western prairies adapted by cultivating coarse feed grains instead of wheat. These were fed to pigs on the east coast to make into bacon for Britain. New Zealand responded to Britain's request for cheese. At the same time, the United States provided deboned and telescoped beef so as to fit as much as possible into ships' holds, canned spam and sausages, cheese and dried egg. In order to reach North Africa, Crimp's ship had sailed from England to Durban before continuing up the east coast of Africa and into the Suez Canal. German U-boats had effectively closed the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, and all troops and supplies for the North African campaign were forced to make the long journey around the Cape. This caused chaos in the Red Sea ports, as they did not have the capacity to cope with the more than 5 million tons of imported goods that were needed for the military campaign alone. Matters were made worse by American businessmen, not yet in the war, trying to capitalize on the shortage of consumer goods in the Middle East. Incongruous piles of crates of stockings and underwear imported from the United States began to build up on the docks alongside tanks and military supplies. The Middle East was saved from chaos by the Middle East Supply Centre, which successfully coordinated the food stocks, industrial production, and import needs of the region so that it remained stable despite the wartime disruption. Meanwhile, the military campaign was not going well, and in the summer of 1942, the Allies were driven back across the desert towards Cairo. On their diet of bully beef and biscuit, the troops fell sick with jaundice, dysentery, vitamin deficiency diseases, and battle fatigue. Large consignments of tinned fruit were brought up from South Africa in an effort to supply the men with vitamins, fibre, and the will to fight. Winston Churchill was determined to prioritise the needs of the troops fighting to push the Germans off the African continent, but the demands on British shipping were increasing. The United States was supplying less meat to Britain than it had promised, and the Ministry of Food was lobbying hard for extra ships to be sent to Argentina and Australia to replenish Britain's depleted meat reserves. Churchill therefore decided to safeguard the supply of food imports into Britain and cut the number of ships sailing to the Indian Ocean by 60%. The consequences for the subjects of the empire were severe. In East Africa, forced conscription took many men off the reserves and into the army. Others were recruited as labourers in the ports and railways, and as hands on white settlers' farms in the Rhodesias in Kenya. The elderly, women and children left behind on the reserves struggled to plant in time for when the long rains began in February. Added to this, the colonial administrations were pressing for the peasants to sell as much maize as possible to the government. That this left poorer households without food reserves and vulnerable to famine simply did not enter into their calculations. In mid-February 1943, 2 ships scheduled for India were diverted to take grain to East Africa to ease the situation. The Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, protested against these diversions, for a food crisis was brewing in India. But Churchill and his scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, were unsympathetic. Churchill regarded Eastern colonial governments as improvident, and pronounced that there was no reason why all parts of the British Empire should not feel the pinch in the same way as the mother country has done. In 1943, Ian Stevens, editor of the Calcutta newspaper The Statesman, was struck by how quietly famine comes. There was no shouting, no violence, no looting of shops. The starving simply wandered about, bewildered and finding no help, squatted in the byways and grew feebler and lay down and after a while died. It took an 8-week campaign on the part of The Statesman, which ran editorials and published photographs of the dead and dying on the streets of Calcutta, before the British government in London finally acknowledged in October 1943 that Bengal had been struck by famine. And it was only when Lord Wavell replaced the incompetent Linlithgow as Viceroy that any decisive action was taken to remedy the appalling situation. The military now escorted deliveries of rice to rural areas, price controls were enforced, and rationing was introduced. People continued to die, but the starving and the destitute on Calcutta's streets were rounded up to perish out of sight in special camps. While just over 31,000 Allied infantry died in the North Africa campaign, around 3 million Bengalis died from starvation and the effects of malnutrition. Incompetence in India certainly exacerbated the situation, but Churchill and his war cabinet deliberately chose to sacrifice India's population to hunger. The British civilians' wartime ration was heavily dependent on bread and potatoes, both of which were unrationed. To the nutritionist's satisfaction, however, from 1942, the national loaf was wholemeal. In the interwar years, there had still been poor families in Britain for whom meat was a rare treat. Now, rationing guaranteed every working-class person a shilling's worth of meat per week, as well as 4 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces each of cheese and butter, 4 ounces of margarine, 3 pints of milk, an egg or its equivalent in dried egg powder, 8 ounces of sugar, and 2 ounces of tea. In addition, the Subcommittee on Food Policy managed to ensure a programme of free school meals, priority supplies of milk for pregnant women and nursing mothers, as well as milk, orange juice, and cod liver oil for under 5s. Rickets and vitamin deficiency diseases all but disappeared in Britain, and maternal and infant mortality rates improved. The stubborn pocket of working-class deprivation was at last removed. During the war, the hierarchy of priorities that had always operated within the Empire became glaringly obvious. British citizens were prioritised. Below them were the white settlers in the Dominions, and last and definitely least came Britain's colonial subjects. The Bengalis, who died of famine in their millions, and the East Africans forced to sell their reserves of maize and robbed of food security, were not simply suffering from unrelated wartime shortages. They were the other side of the coin that ensured that the British were well fed and maintained their health and energy throughout the war. The trading rules of the Empire had always been rigged in favour of Britain. The war both intensified the exploitation of colonialism and exposed the hollowness of its rhetoric. On the 20th of December 1926, Lord Meath, the organiser of the Empire Day movement, had invited representatives from various colonies to make an Empire Christmas pudding in London. As each ingredient was carried in by turbaned Indian servants, it was formally announced as if it were a guest at a ball, and was then added to an enormous mixing bowl. The ceremony finished with representatives from Canada, Australia, South Africa, British Guiana, Jamaica and India coming together to give the pudding a collective ritual stir. Part of the invented tradition of the Victorian Christmas was Stir Up Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent, when each member of the family gave the mixture a stir while making a wish. The Empire Day pudding ceremony created a powerful visual image of the Empire as Britain's family. Shared food habits and tastes create the feeling that we belong to a larger group. To trace the history of the national foods of former British colonies is to create a web of connections that the British Empire wove around the globe. These developments created a system that connected all 5 inhabited continents and shaped the eating habits of the modern world. Although the empire has long since been dismantled, its legacy lives on in how Britain and its former colonies define their national identities.